What is the problem of evil? The problem of evil is the question of how a God who has the traditional attributes that adherents of Judaism, Christianity, Islam and other faiths believe, namely, among other things, omnipotence, being all-powerful, omniscience, God is all-knowing, and morally perfect, which it's trendy to call now in the philosophical literature omnibenevolence, but perfect moral goodness. If God has those attributes among others, how come there is so much evil in the world? And by evil is meant roughly all of the bad stuff that happens. Philosophers conventionally distinguish between natural evil and moral evil. Natural evil means phenomena like hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, illness, and so forth. Moral evil denotes the terrible things that we human beings do to each other and have always done, murder, rape, robbery, and so forth. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and completely good, how is it that any of this makes its way into the world? As Hume, the great 18th century Scottish philosopher, so appropriate to mention in the context of St Andrews, points out in his dialogues concerning natural religion, if God is all-powerful, then he has the capacity, the power to stop any evil. If he's all-knowing, then we can't excuse God, as it were, by saying that he's not aware of all the evil in the world. And if he's completely good, then obviously he has motivation to stop any evil. Well, you'll have picked up that when I say evil, I'm referring to broadly what might be construed as suffering, and indeed many people writing in this area refer to the problem of suffering rather than the problem of evil. There are pros and cons of each piece of terminology. I'm going to use them more or less interchangeably. But that's the question. How do we square the existence of a God who is all-powerful, all-knowing and all-good with the existence of natural and moral evil, with all this suffering in the world? And we have not just suffering, but a great range of suffering in the world, depth, scope, and distribution as well. Problem of evil in the contemporary philosophical discussion, and Miriam talks about people coming to their entries with different perspectives. So I've come to my Jewish theological entry from the perspective of someone trained in analytic philosophy. So my entry is really doing what's come to be known as analytic theology. There are other ways of doing philosophy and other ways of doing theology, but this is my approach. In the contemporary philosophical discussion on the problem of evil, a distinction is conventionally made between what's termed the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem. The logical problem puts the question of the problem, puts the problem of evil very sharply, and says, isn't there a logical contradiction between the existence of a God who is all-powerful, all-knowing and all-good and the existence of evil? It can't be the case that those two things happen at the same time, and that's often mobilized, as it was by J.L. Mackie in the 50s in a famous article, into an argument from evil, since it's impossible that evil could exist in the way it does in our world if God has these attributes, and God it's often said necessarily has these attributes. In other words, if he doesn't have all these attributes, he's not God. It shows that there is no such God. The traditional God of Judaism, Christianity, and so on simply doesn't exist. That's the logical problem of evil, which has somewhat gone out of fashion and is now eclipsed largely by the evidential argument from evil, which says it's not a contradiction. It's logically possible that God would have all these attributes and that there be evil in the world. That is logically possible, but the existence of the kind of evil we have in the world is good evidence against the existence of a God with the traditional attributes. And that leaves it open for people to argue, as many have, that we can come up with, even if we concede that the existence of evil is evidence against the existence of the traditional God, we can draw on other kinds of evidence to show that nevertheless God exists. So the evidential problem is slightly It's slightly less sharp, but it's still a very substantial problem. Okay. Mentioned the logical, evidential, natural, and moral. Important to say, as I point out at the beginning of the article, that there is a typically Jewish way of framing the problem. The traditional way of framing the problem in the contemporary philosophical literature, and this goes back some centuries, precisely how far is a matter of scholarly dispute, but the conventional way of presenting the problem is, how can there be evil if God is omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect? How can there be evil at all? Our classic Jewish sources tend not to be troubled by the existence of evil as much as by the distribution of evil. Hence, we get the question framed typically as Tzadik v'Ral or Rasha v'Tov, as we say in Hebrew. How is it that good people often apparently suffer terribly in this world, whereas people who seem to us to be wicked seem to flourish? A question that Jeremiah asks in chapter 12. It's a question that is asked in the book of Job. It's a question in the first bit of the Babylonian Talmud, Brachot, that Moses asks God to explain. That's how the problem of evil tends to be framed. Why is an interesting issue. I addressed that briefly in the entry as well. But that's important to note. Okay, in the remaining 8 minutes plus injury time that I have, 4 approaches. So these are 4 approaches which are there in the contemporary analytic philosophical discussion, but I think are fruitful to bring into conversation with the relevant Jewish sources. They offer a useful way of grouping most of the Jewish approaches to the problem of evil. So the first 2 approaches I'll take together, theodicy and defense. I'm taking a leaf out of the book of the wonderful David Schatz, professor of philosophy at Yeshiva University, who talks about anti-theodicy and skeptical theism, which we'll come to in a couple of minutes, as cousins. I'd like to describe theodicy and defense as siblings, with theodicy as the rather more stroppy and aggressive sibling, and defense as the rather easier going sibling. And theodicy, a theodicy which comes from, the etymology is theos, God, in Greek, dike, justice, justifying God. So theodicy aims to resolve the problem of evil by offering a morally sufficient reason for why a God who is all-powerful, all-good, and all-knowing would nevertheless allow the kinds of evil that we see in our world. And a theodicist is the more stroppy sibling, because he or she says, the reason I'm offering you as my theodicy, whatever it might be, we'll come to examples in a second, that is the reason. I am claiming in my theodicy that is the reason that evil exists in the world. Whereas the way most philosophers construe the distinction between theodicy and defense, the person offering defense says, I'm suggesting a reason why it might be that God allows evil, and why it might be that you can reconcile the existence of a totally good and powerful God with evil. And I'm saying, for all we know, this might be the reason. It's plausible enough, but I'm not claiming that it is the reason. So that's theodicies and defense. It's important to point out that theodicy is, in Jewish tradition, in its long history, Jewish theological tradition, the major approach. That is the approach. It doesn't mean it's necessarily the best approach, but it's certainly the dominant approach. Historically. So examples of theodicies or defenses, 3 very famous ones. Firstly, punishment theodicy. So this is the claim that all evil that we see in the world, all suffering is a punishment for sin. That is something which is very interestingly treated in our classic sources. The book, of course, is full of Job's friends saying to him, you must have done something wrong in order to have been punished, in order to have God have let you undergo this terrible suffering. And fascinating, of course, as many point out, at the end of the book, it's quite clear that God prefers the aggressive questioning of Job to the pious punishment theodicy presented by his friends. So the Book of Job seems to undermine punishment theodicy, at least according to many readings. But in our rabbinic tradition, classical rabbinic sources, particularly the Mishnah, the foundational document of Torah Shebaal Peh, of the oral law, and the Jerusalem Talmud, you will see punishment theodicy all over the place, and not many other approaches to the problem of evil. By contrast with the Babylonian Talmud, which has a whole range of theodicies, and which, of course, itself suggests that not everyone agrees that punishment theodicy is a correct theodicy. But not only that, in Tractate Shabbat, we have the Talmud unusually coming to a definite theological conclusion on a discussion and saying explicitly, Tiyufta de Rav Ami Tiyufta, we reject Rabbi Ami's opinion that all sin, that all suffering is a punishment for sin. So we have a range of views, and punishment theology has loomed large throughout the ages, going back to Augustine in the Christian tradition, in the Western discussion of theodicy. Second famous theodicy, how are we doing? 4 minutes? Second theodicy, which is very central, is the famous free will theodicy, or it can be a free will defense, depending on how we're presenting it, made famous by, among others, in the contemporary philosophical discussion, Alvin Plantinga, who actually relevant, that's to say in this context. I once had the privilege of hearing Alvin Plantinga speak. It was a Stanton lecture at Cambridge, and his work is pretty dense and very, very voluminous. And I was expecting this rather dry philosopher, and he was so entertaining. And it was clear to me, and I think others in the audience, that the reason he was so entertaining, so ebullient, so full of life, was he actually genuinely believes in a good God. It's kind of, well, this just shone through. It was just a wonderful way to exist. So in his treatment of the problem of evil, he has a famous free will defense. The idea is familiar to us, namely that free will, God giving us the ability to freely choose between good and evil, is an enormous good. It enables, many argue, moral action, enables us to have full moral responsibility, may enable many other things as well, like love. And the price we pay for that is, or the price God is prepared to let us pay for that, is that people have the opportunity of defying God and choosing evil rather than good. So that, in a nutshell, is the free will defense or free will theodicy, which can be challenged in many ways. Perhaps most obviously, well, it might, if you accept it, it might work for moral evil, but how's it going to work for natural evil? How do you explain earthquakes along those lines? So many objections, but for the purposes of the bringing this into conversation with Jewish sources, free will looms large in our sources, appears very clearly in the Torah, which where God gives us a choice between good and evil, between life and death. Maimonides, in his Mishneh Torah, Maimonides, our greatest medieval Jewish philosopher, in the laws of Teshuvah, laws of repentance, waxes eloquent about the doctrine of free will as Amud HaTorah v'HaMitzvah, the pillar of the Torah and the commandments. He says, what room would there be for the whole theology of reward and punishment in Judaism? Without that, what would the point be of all the works of the prophets? And in the Guide of the Perplexed, his philosophical magnum opus, he actually, among many other approaches to the problem of evil, offers a free will theodicy. Free will theodicy famously recurs in 20th century contemporary Jewish theology in the context of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, with Eliezer Berkowitz's approach based on the idea of Hester Panim, of divine hiddenness, or the hiding of God's face, which is essentially a free will theodicy. Okay, how are we doing, roughly 3 minutes? Doing great, okay. Third theodicy to mention, soul-making. So the most famous exponent of soul-making theodicy in the contemporary philosophical discussion is John Hick in his famous book Evil and the God of Love. And the basic idea, again, is that suffering is character building. So if we go through a bit of adversity, then it can make us better people. Hick actually is construes it both ways. So suffering can soul make for the sufferer. It can let the sufferer build up his or her resilience and trust in God and steadfastness and so on. It can also be soul-making, be good for the moral and spiritual development of third parties, of onlookers who are challenged not to be cruel, not to be indifferent, but to empathize with the sufferer and to help the sufferer. And he argues as well that many key virtues would not be possible in a world without suffering. So in order to have compassion and courage and love and persistence and steadfastness in the world, this needs to be not a hedonistic paradise, as he puts it. It needs to be a world full of problems and challenges and setbacks. So that is a major theodicy in the current philosophical discussion, has interesting echoes in the Jewish tradition. Just mention one because of the time, which is Rabbi Joseph Albo, great medieval philosopher, Sefer Ikarim, the Book of Principles, who interprets the rabbinic idea of Yisurin Shalahava, the sufferings of love, which is the topic of the longest classical rabbinic discussion of suffering, which is in a Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Brachot. Albo interprets the doctrine of sufferings of love as meaning some kind of soul-making theodicy. The basic idea is that God wants to make people whom he especially values for their spiritual achievements actually go through something difficult when he knows they're prepared to do it in theory. Because once they've actually been through it, then it will influence their characters more strongly than if they just intended to do it. Okay, that leaves us 2 minutes for the last two approaches. So that was theodicy. Third approach after theodicies and defenses, skeptical theism. Very, very trendy, skeptical theism in the contemporary analytic philosophical discussion. Basic idea, skeptical theism, a bit of a problematic term because the adjective doesn't qualify the noun. They're really talking about two separate things. So a skeptical theist is a person who is a theist, believes in the traditional God, but is skeptical, not about the existence of God, but skeptical about human cognitive ability. If the God in whom traditional theists believe were to create a world, we would expect that we might not be able to understand everything that God does. In his knowledge, his power, his ability to see connections between events and processes exceeds ours by an infinite amount. And therefore, things may happen which we can't see any good reason, we can't see any justification for God allowing a certain event to happen. But if we had a God's eye view and we could see how everything fits together and what the long-term consequences of events are and how they relate to each other and so on and so forth, then for all we know, there would be such a reason. That in a nutshell is skeptical theism. And the fact that we can't see a reason doesn't mean there isn't one there. It's known as the famous no-seeum inference. If a no-seeum, they ain't there. That's what skeptical theism argues against and says we may not be able to see God's reasons even if they are there and even if they are good. Skeptical theism, interestingly, is presaged in our classical Jewish sources in several places. The book of Job, I would argue, God's big speech out of the whirlwind at the end of the book, saying to Job, "Where were you when I created the world?" Seems to be suggesting kind of skeptical theism. We have the statement in Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, that we just don't know why the wicked suffer and why the wicked prosper often and the righteous suffer. Classic Jewish formulation of problem in terms of distribution. Talmudic passage I mentioned before in Brachot 7a, Moses asks God, why is the distribution of evil as puzzling as it is? And God, according to Rabbi Meir's opinion in a Talmudic discussion, refuses to answer the question. We can't know that. Skeptical theism. Okay, finally, must be an injury time now. Okay, but not Premiership injury time. So the reasonable injury time allowed in the Euros. So anti-theodicy is the idea basically that there is something wrong with theodicy. One major variety of anti-theodicy is there's something morally wrong with theodicy. It's not, and what is wrong with it is that it makes peace with evil and suffering by explaining why God is justified in permitting it we make peace with it, and that can undermine our motivation to combat it, whereas what religion and morality require is fighting evil, is trying to eliminate it, or at least to ameliorate it as much as possible. And that strand is heavily picked up on in post-Holocaust Jewish theology. Rabbi Soloveitchik in Out of the World and elsewhere is very keen on that line. It's very interesting. He sometimes appears to be advocating skeptical theism, but often in the same passage you can see he's sliding into anti-theodicy. Famously, he says the question why God is allowing this evil to happen is the wrong question. Religiously, it's not only futile, it undermines us. We should be asking what he calls the ethical question, or the halachic question, the Jewish legal question. What should I be doing about this? That's the correct religious response. And that presages, in a way, Emil Fackenheim's famous 614th commandment, where Fackenheim says, after the Holocaust, it's not worth asking why. It's not productive to ask why. What we have emerging from Auschwitz is an ethical imperative not to grant Hitler a posthumous victory, Fackenheim's famous 614th commandment. Levinas, in a similar vein, talks about the scandal of theodicy, that theodicy is positively dangerous. So those are four approaches to the problem of evil, which are important in Jewish tradition: theodicy, defense, skeptical theism, and anti-theodicy. They all have their pros and cons from a Jewish theological perspective. But if you'd like to know more, please look at the entry. And if you'd like to know even more, please wait for the book. Thank you very much.